Imagine living in a hole dug in the ground, surrounded by mud, rats, and constant fear. Now imagine that, in this harsh environment, someone tells you that you cannot shoot the enemy unless they shoot first. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Sounds like a sentence of extreme risk. But this seemingly absurd rule became one of the most effective strategies for preserving the mental sanity of soldiers during one of the most brutal conflicts in human history. This is the story of how a commander defied all military conventions and, in doing so, discovered something profound about human nature, about war, and about survival. We are about to delve into a narrative that challenges everything you think you know about military combat. A story that begins in the muddy trenches of World War I and reveals surprising truths about human psychology, leadership, and the extraordinary capacity of humankind to create order even in the most absolute chaos. Prepare to meet commanders who dared to think differently, soldiers who found humanity on the battlefield, and a rule as simple as it is revolutionary that completely changed the experience of war for thousands of men. Before we continue, if you enjoy fascinating and little-known stories from history, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us what time you're watching this video. Now, let's go back to the trenches of 1916. The year is 1916. Europe is immersed in the third year of what would be called the Great War, a conflict that completely redefined the meaning of the word war. On the plains of Flanders, in France and Belgium, millions of men live buried in complex trench systems that stretch for hundreds of kilometers. These are not simple holes in the ground. They are complete underground cities with kitchens, medical posts, ammunition depots, and dormitories. Some trenches even have makeshift chapels and small libraries. But don't be fooled by the infrastructure. Life in the trenches is a constant nightmare. Mud rises to your knees, mixed with dirty water and waste of all kinds. The rats are enormous, the size of cats. Diseases spread rapidly. Trench foot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to dampness and cold, severely damages soldiers' feet, often leading to amputations. The smell is terrible, a combination of mud, mold, dampness, and poor sanitation. And then there's the noise. The constant, endless, deafening noise. Artillery explosions that make the earth tremble. The crackle of rifles. The sounds of combat. The whistling of bullets cutting through the air. This noise never stops. Even in moments of relative calm, there's always the distant sound of bombardment in other sections of the line. Soldiers learn to sleep with this noise, but they never truly get used to it. The human brain wasn't made to process this constant level of threatening stimuli. The military commanders of the time followed doctrines established centuries ago. Aggressiveness was valued above all else. Shoot first, shoot more, shoot constantly. Keep the opponent under constant pressure. Never give rest, never show weakness. These were the golden rules of military combat. And in theory, they made sense. In theory, an opponent constantly under pressure would eventually break, their lines would crumble, and victory would be achieved. But the First World War was not a theoretical war. It was trench warfare, a completely new type of conflict for which no one was truly prepared. The old tactics didn't work. Constant aggression didn't lead to victory, only to terrible losses. Frontal assaults against machine guns and barbed wire resulted in devastating casualty numbers. In a single day of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army suffered almost 60,000 casualties. 60,000 men, including dead, wounded, and missing, in 24 hours. And to gain what? A few meters of destroyed ground that would be lost the following week. In this context of intense combat, a phenomenon began to emerge that the high military command simply could not understand. In certain sections of the front, particularly in areas where the same units faced each other for long periods, something strange began to happen. The gunfire decreased. Not completely, but noticeably. There were periods when practically no shots were fired, despite both sides having abundant ammunition and clear orders to maintain pressure on the adversary. The generals were furious. They accused the soldiers of cowardice, lack of discipline, and treachery. They ordered punitive attacks, night raids, artillery bombardments, anything to force the men back into the fight with the expected intensity. But the more they pressed, the more passive resistance they encountered. Not open mutinies, but a kind of collective slowness, a general reluctance to escalate the violence. What the generals failed to understand, trapped in their secure barracks miles behind the front lines, was that the soldiers in the trenches were developing their own survival system. An unsanctioned, unofficial system, but profoundly rational from the perspective of those who actually lived under constant fire. It was in this context that our story unfolds. In a specific section of the front, under the command of an officer whom we will simply call Commander Harrison, an extraordinary rule was implemented. Harrison was not a high-ranking general. He was a field officer, someone who lived in the trenches with his men, who ate the same hard food, who breathed the same heavy air, who experienced the same daily hardships. Harrison watched his men carefully. He saw them return from shifts on the front lines not only physically exhausted, but psychologically devastated. He saw men trembling uncontrollably, unable to hold a cup of tea without spilling. He saw experienced soldiers, veterans of months of combat, who suddenly began to cry for no apparent reason. He saw 20-year-olds with the gazes of 80-year-olds, empty, distant, as if something fundamental had been ripped from within them. Military medicine of the time had a term for it, bomb shock. But Harrison realized there was more to it than that. Bomb shock affected men who experienced particularly intense bombardments, but Harrison saw the psychological toll even during periods of relative calm. There was something about the very nature of constant combat, the endless vigilance, the impossibility of truly relaxing even for a moment, that was breaking his men from the inside out. And then Harrison did something his superiors would consider insubordination, perhaps even treason. He implemented a simple rule for his section of the trench. His men should not initiate fire unless directly attacked. No shooting for the sake of shooting. No firing randomly toward enemy trenches just to maintain pressure. No provoking unnecessary confrontations. Respond when attacked, yes. Defend oneself, absolutely. But no escalation, no provoking, no initiating. It seems simple, almost obvious in retrospect. But in the military culture of the time, it was absolute heresy. It was everything an officer should not do. It was passivity, it was weakness, it was practically giving the adversary a free advantage. The military manuals, the tradition, the superiors, everything said that Harrison was making a terrible mistake that would lead to disaster. But something extraordinary happened. Within weeks, Harrison noticed dramatic changes in his men. The tremors lessened. Cases of bomb shock dropped drastically. Soldiers who had previously returned from frontline tours completely devastated now came back tired. Yes, but not destroyed. They still had the energy to talk, to laugh occasionally, to behave like human beings instead of walking ghosts. Even more surprisingly, the casualty rate didn't increase. In fact, at times, it even decreased. How was this possible? If Harrison's men weren't firing as much, shouldn't they be more vulnerable? Shouldn't the enemy be advancing, taking advantage of this apparent weakness? Here we enter one of the most fascinating and least understood aspects of trench warfare. The unofficial system of live and let live. Historians took decades to fully understand this phenomenon, but it was widespread in the trenches of the First World War. In essence, soldiers on both sides, without any formal communication, without official agreements, developed tacit systems of coexistence. It worked more or less like this. If one side didn't attack during breakfast, the other side wouldn't attack either. If a section of the German trenches didn't fire during certain times, the opposing British section also remained quiet. There were even documented cases of soldiers shouting warnings before routine bombing raids. Something like, "Watch out, we're gonna bomb in 5 minutes," giving the other side time to take cover. Why? Why would opposing soldiers develop this kind of cooperation? The answer lies in game theory, although no one at the time knew the term. Both sides were trapped in a repeated prisoner's dilemma. If both attacked constantly, both would suffer enormously. If both showed restraint, both would live longer. And since the same units frequently faced each other for months, there was enough time to establish these patterns of behavior. What Harrison did was institutionalize and formalize, within his own unit, a behavior that was already emerging naturally. But by making it an official rule, he removed the anxiety and guilt that soldiers felt about not constantly firing. It was no longer cowardice or disobedience. It was following orders. And that made all the psychological difference. Consider the psychological difference between these two situations. In the first, a soldier knows he should be shooting, but chooses not to because he is exhausted, afraid, or simply doesn't see the point. He carries guilt, anxiety about being discovered, and fear of failing his comrades. In the second situation, the same soldier doesn't shoot because he has been ordered to show restraint. He doesn't carry guilt. There is no anxiety about doing the wrong thing. Psychologically, the difference is enormous. But there's more. Harrison's rule also introduced something that was desperately absent from trench warfare: predictability. Under normal circumstances, a soldier in the trenches never knew when the next attack would come. Could be at any time, day or night. This constant unpredictability is one of the most stressful things the human brain can experience. We are programmed to deal with threats, but we are programmed to deal with defined threats with a beginning, middle, and end. The infinite threat, always present but never realized, destroys us psychologically. With Harrison's rule, there was predictability. If no one attacked you, you didn't attack. Simple. This allowed soldiers to relax at least a little during calm periods. And that small relief, that small window of psychological rest, made a monumental difference to mental health. Now, it's crucial to understand that this didn't turn the trenches into summer camps. There was still constant danger, there was still risk, there were still artillery bombardments that arrived without warning. Harrison's rule applied primarily to rifle and machine gun fire, not to artillery bombardments which were coordinated by much higher-ranking officers. But even so, it significantly reduced the overall level of violence in his section of the front. The results were so remarkable that they began to attract attention. Other officers visited Harrison's section, expecting to find relaxed, undisciplined, poorly prepared soldiers. Instead, they found alert, fit men with relatively high morale given the circumstances. The trenches were well maintained, the weapons in good condition, the discipline seemingly solid. And combat stress rates were less than half the average of other units. Let that sink in for a moment. Under virtually identical conditions of combat, exposure, and danger, the men under Harrison's rule showed half the symptoms of traumatic stress compared to other units. That's not a marginal improvement. It's a complete transformation. But how is this possible? How could simply not shooting as much have such a dramatic effect? To understand this, we need to understand how combat stress actually works in the human brain. And here we enter the fascinating territory of neuroscience and psychology, knowledge that would only emerge decades later, but which helps to explain what Harrison intuitively understood. The human brain has ancient, primitive systems for dealing with threats. When you perceive danger, your amygdala, an ancient structure in the center of the brain, triggers an alarm. Stress hormones flood your body. Your heart races, your muscles tense, your vision narrows, focusing on the threat. This is the famous fight-or-flight system, and it's extremely effective at dealing with immediate, short-term threats. But here's the problem. This system was never designed to be constantly switched on. In ancestral nature, threats were episodic. Predator appears, you fight or flee, and then there's a recovery period. Your nervous system returns to a resting state, stress hormones are metabolized, your body repairs itself. The cycle is complete. In trench warfare, this cycle never completes. The threat never truly goes away. Even when nothing is happening, you know something could happen at any second. So your threat system remains perpetually activated, in a state that modern neuroscientists would call chronic hyperarousal. And your body simply wasn't made for that. Over time, this constant state of alert wears down crucial brain systems. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational decision-making, begins to malfunction. The hippocampus, crucial for memory formation, suffers measurable physical damage. Connections between different parts of the brain begin to deteriorate. The result is what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, but which at the time was simply known as being broken by war. What Harrison's rule did was introduce periods of genuine relative calm. Not complete calm, there was never that in the trenches, but moments when the threat level dropped significantly. And in those moments, the soldiers' stress systems could, at least partially, shut down. The threat response recovery cycle could occasionally complete. And that made all the difference. There's another psychological factor at play here, something that has to do with agency and control. One of the most traumatic aspects of any prolonged dangerous situation is the feeling of powerlessness, that you have no control over your own destiny. In the trenches, soldiers were literally powerless in the face of many threats. An artillery bombardment would arrive without warning. You simply waited and prayed that it wouldn't fall directly on you. There was nothing you could do to protect yourself other than crouch down and wait for it to pass. This powerlessness is psychologically devastating. Modern studies show that people who have some degree of control over stressful situations cope much better psychologically than those who have no control at all, even if the objective level of stress is the same. The feeling that your actions matter, that you have some influence over what happens to you, is fundamental to maintaining mental health. Harrison's rule gave soldiers a sense of agency. If they didn't attack, the enemy probably wouldn't attack either. Their actions had predictable consequences. They had some control, however small, over their environment. And that was psychologically restorative in profound ways. Now, it would be natural to ask, why didn't other commanders do the same? If the results were so obviously positive, why wasn't Harrison's rule widely adopted? The answer lies in the complex politics and military culture of the time. First, there was the issue of established military doctrine. The armed forces of all nations involved had centuries of military tradition emphasizing aggression, initiative, and keeping the adversary under constant pressure. Commanders were promoted based on their aggressiveness, how many attacks they launched, and how willing they were to accept casualties in pursuit of victory. A commander who deliberately reduced the level of combat was seen as weak, no matter how positive the results were in terms of the troops' mental health. Secondly, there was a genuine misunderstanding about what caused combat stress. Most senior officers believed that soldiers showing symptoms of trauma were simply weak, cowardly, or faking it to avoid combat. The idea that the constant combat environment itself could break even the strongest men was seen as sentimental nonsense. It was believed that men of true moral fiber would never break, no matter what they faced. This attitude led to terrible treatments. Soldiers who could no longer function due to traumatic stress were often severely punished for cowardice. Men who trembled uncontrollably, who couldn't stop crying, who were paralyzed with fear, faced severe punishments that served as an example to others. Today we recognize these men as victims of severe psychological trauma, essentially wounded by war as much as anyone with physical injuries. But at the time, they were seen as moral failures deserving of punishment. In that cultural context, what Harrison was doing was profoundly subversive. He was essentially saying that his superiors were wrong about the nature of combat, wrong about what made soldiers effective, wrong about how to preserve fighting strength. He was putting the well-being of his men above established doctrine, and that was dangerous for his own career. In fact, when Harrison's superiors finally discovered what he was doing, he faced serious consequences. There were threats of court-martial, accusations of incompetence, suggestions that he was secretly being negligent. Only the undeniably positive results of his unit, the low stress levels, and the relatively high morale saved Harrison from severe punishment. But even with these results, the rule was never officially adopted or expanded. The high command could not accept an approach that seemed so contrary to everything they believed about warfare and military leadership. And so, it remained a local experiment, known only to those directly involved and a few curious visiting officers. It is worth pausing here and considering a deeper philosophical question. What does Harrison's story tell us about the nature of authority and innovation? Harrison was a mid-level officer, without formal authority to change military doctrine. But he had moral and practical authority derived from being there, in the trenches, living the problem he was trying to solve. He wasn't theorizing in a safe office. He was directly experiencing the hell he was asking his men to endure, and it was this proximity to the problem that gave him insights that his superiors, isolated from the reality of the trenches, simply could not have. No matter how intelligent the generals were, no matter how many maps they studied or how many reports they read, they could not truly understand what it was like to live under constant threat, day after day, week after week, month after month. This points to a fundamental tension in any hierarchical organization. Those at the top have formal authority and broad strategic vision, but those at the bottom have detailed tactical knowledge and direct experience of the problems. Successful organizations find ways to integrate these two perspectives. Dysfunctional organizations treat all innovation coming from below with suspicion and resistance. The military machine of the First World War was profoundly dysfunctional in this respect. There was an almost insurmountable chasm between the experiences and perspectives of the rank-and-file soldiers and those of the high-ranking commanders. And this chasm cost millions of lives. How much sooner could Harrison's rule have been widely implemented? How many minds could have been spared permanent trauma if the high command had been less arrogant, less bound by doctrine, more open to learning from those who actually lived through the war? But let's return to our specific story. Harrison's rule, though never officially sanctioned, had a lasting impact in other ways. Soldiers who served under Harrison and survived the war took those lessons with them. Some became officers in World War II, and there is evidence that they implemented variations of the same approach under appropriate circumstances. The idea that preserving the mental health of troops was not a luxury but an operational necessity began, very slowly, to permeate military thinking. It took decades, but eventually military psychology began to be taken seriously. Programs were developed to identify and treat combat stress. Rotations were implemented to ensure that soldiers did not remain in intense combat zones indefinitely. Support systems were created. None of this would have seemed natural or necessary to the generals of World War I, but it slowly became an accepted part of modern military practice. And in all of this, we can trace a tenuous line back to Harrison's Trench, where an officer decided there was a better way, that preserving his men meant not only keeping them physically alive, but psychologically whole. That victory meant not only gaining ground, but bringing his men back still capable of functioning as human beings. There are also lessons here about the nature of violence and peace. One of the most deeply ingrained beliefs about war is that it is a state of total violence, where any restraint is weakness. But Harrison's story shows that even in war, even in the most extreme circumstances, there is room for moderation, for restraint, for recognizing the shared humanity even with those you are nominally trying to kill. The soldiers on both sides who participated in the tacit live and let live systems were not pacifists. They would fight if necessary, defend their countries if called upon. But they also recognized that there was a difference between fulfilling their duty and unnecessarily escalating violence. That you could be an effective soldier without seeking unnecessary confrontation. This challenges simplistic narratives about war and human nature. We are not simply violent beings waiting for any excuse for conflict, nor are we peaceful angels led astray by society. We are complex beings, capable of both extreme aggression and remarkable compassion, often simultaneously. And the structures, rules, and expectations we create can push that balance in one direction or another. Harrison's rule pushed toward humanity, toward restraint, toward the recognition that the adversary on the other side was also a human being trapped in terrible circumstances, probably as desperate to survive as you. And this recognition, far from weakening the soldiers, actually strengthened them psychologically, giving them structure and meaning in a situation that was otherwise chaotic and meaningless. Now, I don't want to romanticize this excessively. The trenches of the First World War were terrible. Harrison's rule improved things, but it didn't make them good. Men still suffered losses, still faced immense hardship, were still wounded and traumatized. In certain sections of the front, where the fighting was particularly intense or where commanders were particularly aggressive, systems like Harrison's could never take hold. The war remained brutal, senseless, and devastating. But within this difficult context, Harrison and his men created something remarkable. A small space of sanity, an island of relative humanity in an ocean of hardship. And they did this not through superior weapons or brilliant tactics, but simply through the conscious decision not to escalate violence unnecessarily, to preserve the mental and emotional capacity of their men, to treat psychological well-being as important as physical well-being. The data was undeniable. The combat stress rate in Harrison's unit was approximately 50% lower than average. 50% fewer soldiers breaking down psychologically, fewer men waking up screaming from nightmares, fewer cases of uncontrollable tremors, fewer complete mental collapses. And this did not come at the cost of reduced military effectiveness. Harrison's unit accomplished its missions, held its line section, and responded effectively when attacked. In fact, there is a strong argument that Harrison's unit was more militarily effective precisely because its men were psychologically healthier. Soldiers who sleep a little better shoot more accurately. Soldiers who are not constantly on the verge of a nervous breakdown make better decisions under pressure. Soldiers who trust their officers and believe their lives are not being wasted unnecessarily fight with more determination when truly necessary. This points to a counterintuitive truth about military effectiveness. More violence doesn't always mean more effectiveness. Sometimes, strategic restraint, preservation of human and psychological resources, building trust and morale, all of these contribute more to long-term combat capability than simply maximizing violence at any given moment. The greatest generals in history understood this. Alexander the Great was fierce in battle but treated his troops well outside of it. Caesar was notorious for his clemency towards defeated enemies. Wellington paid careful attention to the well-being of his men. They all understood that soldiers are not machines, they are human beings with psychological and emotional limits, and that pushing them beyond those limits results not in super soldiers but in broken men incapable of functioning. Unfortunately, the high command in World War I seemed to have forgotten these lessons. They treated men as renewable resources, pieces on a chessboard that could be sacrificed and replaced. Casualty rates were statistical abstractions, not human tragedies. And this disconnect between leadership and lived reality resulted in one of the most destructive and traumatic conflicts in human history. But even in that context, there were Harrison and others like him, officers who refused to dehumanize their men, who maintained compassion and common sense even when surrounded by a rigid military culture. And although their efforts were limited in scope, although they could not change the course of the war, they made a profound difference to those under their direct command. Think about it for a moment. If you were a young soldier in those trenches, the difference between serving under a conventional commander and serving under Harrison could literally determine whether you came out psychologically whole or permanently broken. Your ability to function after the war, to have normal relationships, to sleep without nightmares, to live without constant fear, all of that could depend on that single variable. Whether your commander understood that preserving mental health was just as important as preserving physical health. And how many commanders truly understood this? Very few. The vast majority followed established doctrine, treated psychological trauma as moral weakness, and pushed their men to and beyond the breaking point. And the results were predictable. Generations of traumatized men, unable to reintegrate into civilian life, haunted by memories that never faded. Harrison offered an alternative. Not a perfect solution, circumstances made any perfect solution impossible, but a better, more humane, more sustainable approach. And the men who served under him had significantly better chances of emerging still capable of being fathers, husbands, and functional members of society. There is something profoundly moving about this. In the midst of the worst that humanity can produce, industrial warfare on a massive scale, Harrison tried to preserve the best of humanity. Compassion, rationality, recognition of shared dignity. He couldn't stop the war, he couldn't save everyone, but he could, within his small sphere of authority, make things a little less terrible. And perhaps that's what true leadership means. Not grand heroic gestures or spectacular victories, but the daily, difficult, often unacknowledged work of making things a little better for those under your care, of making decisions based not on what will make you look good to your superiors, but on what will truly help those who depend on you. Harrison risked his career, faced harsh criticism, was accused of weakness and worse. But he remained steadfast because he saw the results. He saw his men remaining more psychologically whole, and that mattered more to him than the approval of distant superiors who had never experienced what he and his men experienced daily. This is courage of a different kind. Not the physical courage to face bullets, although Harrison certainly had that too, but the moral courage to stand up for what you believe is right even when everyone around you says you're wrong. To trust your own observation and judgment against established authority. To put the well-being of your men above your own reputation or career advancement. In the end, the war ended as all wars end, with mutual exhaustion, a Pyrrhic victory, and a peace agreement that planted the seeds for the next conflict. Millions of lives were lost, empires had fallen, the map of Europe was redrawn, and life in the trenches, that particularly difficult experience that defined the war, gradually faded from direct memory, preserved only in faded photographs, yellow diaries, and the increasingly faint recollections of increasingly older men. But the lessons remained, or at least they should have remained. The lesson that soldiers are human beings with psychological limitations. The lesson that maximum violence does not always equal maximum effectiveness. The lesson that even in war, there is room for humanity, for restraint, for compassion. The lesson that true leadership means caring for your men, not just as military resources but as people. Unfortunately, many of these lessons had to be painfully relearned in subsequent conflicts. World War II brought its own horrors and traumas. Vietnam demonstrated once again the limits of the human psyche under prolonged combat stress. More recent wars continue to produce alarming numbers of veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. But slowly, very slowly, Harrison's understanding is seeping into mainstream military practice. Combat psychology is now a recognized field. Modern militaries invest significant resources in pre-deployment psychological preparation and post-combat treatment. Rotations are carefully managed to avoid excessively prolonged exposure to intense combat zones. Commanders are trained to recognize signs of excessive stress in their troops. All of this would have seemed revolutionary, perhaps even ridiculous, to the generals of the First World War. But to those who actually lived in the trenches, to those who directly experienced what prolonged combat stress does to the human mind, it would have seemed obvious common sense, long overdue. And perhaps that's the broader lesson. The best solutions to practical problems often come not from distant theorists or established authorities, but from those who experience the problem directly. Harrison wasn't a psychologist, he had no formal training in mental health, he didn't have access to research on traumatic stress. But he had eyes to see his men suffering and an open mind enough to question whether the way they had always done things was really the best way. And this combination, careful observation plus a willingness to question orthodoxy, produced insights that decades of traditional military thinking had completely missed. Not because Harrison was smarter than the generals, but because he was closer to the real problem, more willing to rely on his direct experience against established doctrine. This has applications far beyond the military context. In any field, in any organization, there is tremendous value in listening to those on the front lines, those who actually do the work day in and day out. They see things that distant managers will never see, understand nuances that don't appear in reports, and know the problem in ways that no theory can capture. But it also requires humility on the part of those in power, a willingness to accept that people below them in the hierarchy may have valuable insights, that established doctrine may be wrong, that there is always room for improvement and innovation. And this humility is rare, especially in rigid hierarchical organizations like the military. Harrison possessed that humility. Despite his training, despite the doctrine, despite what everyone around him was saying and doing, he was willing to try something different because he believed there might be a better way. And he was right. His absurd rule, which seemed so contrary to everything that war supposedly was, proved to be profoundly rational, profoundly humane, and profoundly effective. It didn't make war good, nothing could, but it made it a little more bearable, a little less destructive to human mental health, a little more compatible with preserving human dignity and sanity. And in the end, isn't that what we all seek? Ways to make difficult situations a little more bearable? Ways to preserve our humanity even in circumstances that seem designed to destroy it? Methods to care for one another, especially those under our care, in the best way possible given the circumstances. Harrison's story is, ultimately, a story about compassion in action. Not abstract or sentimental compassion, but practical and effective compassion. Compassion that recognizes real human limitations and works within them instead of denying them. Compassion that finds concrete ways to alleviate suffering, even when it cannot eliminate it completely. And perhaps, in the end, that is the most important lesson of all. That even in the worst circumstances, even when surrounded by systems that seem indifferent to human suffering, individuals can make a difference. They can choose to act with compassion, with wisdom, with courage to do what is right instead of what is expected. Harrison made that choice. And because of that choice, hundreds of men had significantly better chances of surviving, not only physically but psychologically. Hundreds of men returned home still able to love their families, to work, to live, instead of forever haunted by horrors they could never forget. This is no small victory. It is a profoundly significant victory, human in the truest sense of the word. And it happened because one man decided that the mental health of his soldiers mattered as much as their ability to fight. That preserving them as whole human beings was as important as preserving them as military assets. How many commanders throughout history have made that choice? Very few. How many should have made it? All of them. But most did not, trapped in mindsets that valued aggression over well-being, doctrine over common sense, the appearance of strength over real effectiveness. Harrison was different, and that difference saved minds, saved lives in a deeper sense than simply preventing physical death. It saved those people's ability to truly live after the war was over. In the grand scheme of the First World War, Harrison's rule was a minor episode, a footnote at best. It didn't change the outcome of the war, it doesn't appear in major history books, it receives no monuments or celebrations. But for those men who served under it, it was everything. It was the difference between coming out whole or broken, between having a future or being permanently imprisoned by a traumatic past. And this reminds us that the most important stories aren't always the ones that appear in history books. Sometimes the most important stories are the small ones, the personal ones, those about individuals making a difference to other individuals, one act of compassion and wisdom at a time. When we look back at the First World War, we see incomprehensible numbers. 16 million dead, millions more wounded, entire nations traumatized. It's easy to get lost in these numbers, to forget that each one represents a real person, a real life, real dreams destroyed. But sometimes, when we focus on a smaller story like that of Harrison and his men, the numbers take on a human face. We can imagine those specific soldiers, visualize their lives improved by a commander's decision to do things differently. And suddenly, the abstract becomes concrete, the distant becomes near. And we can ask ourselves, what lessons does this hold for our own lives? Most of us will never command soldiers in war. But we all have spheres of influence, people who depend on us in some way. We are parents, teachers, managers, friends, citizens. And in all these roles, we face choices about how we treat those under our care or influence. Do we choose to follow rules because they've always been that way? Or do we question whether there's a better way? Do we prioritize appearances and conformity, or the real well-being of people? Do we have the courage to do what we believe is right even when it goes against expectations or established orthodoxy? These are the questions that Harrison's story invites us to consider. And the answers we give in our own lives and circumstances determine what kind of people we are, what kind of leaders we are, what kind of difference we make in the world. Harrison made his choice. In extremely difficult circumstances, when pressured from all sides to conform, he chose compassion. He chose practical wisdom over theoretical doctrine. He chose his men over his career. And that choice resonated through the lives he touched, creating ripples of difference that likely extended far beyond what he himself ever knew. That's the nature of true leadership, of true human impact. You may never know the full extent of the difference you make. Those men Harrison helped keep psychologically whole went home, had families, influenced their children and communities in ways impossible to quantify. The good Harrison did rippled out in ways that could never be fully traced. And the same is true for any act of compassion, any moment of choosing to do what is right over what is easy or expected. We never fully know the impact we have, the lives we touch, the differences we make. But that doesn't make the impact any less real. Harrison's story is a testament to the power of one person to make a significant difference. Not through spectacular heroic actions, although he was certainly courageous, but through consistent, daily decisions to put the well-being of his men first, to think critically about established practices, and to have the courage to do things differently when different seemed better. This is something we can all aspire to in our own spheres and circumstances. We don't need to be at war, we don't need to command troops. But we can all choose compassion over conformity, practical wisdom over rigid doctrine, the real well-being of people over abstract metrics or appearances. And when we make those choices, when we have Harrison's courage to stand up for what we believe is right even when it's difficult, we make a difference. Maybe not on the grand stage of history, but in the real lives of real people. And in the end, that's what truly matters. The trenches of the First World War have long since fallen silent. The men who fought there are gone. Harrison and his soldiers are now just names in old records, faded photographs, memories preserved in dusty diaries. But the lesson remains vital, urgent, eternally relevant. The lesson is that compassion is not weakness. That caring for the mental well-being of those under your care is not a sentimental luxury but a practical necessity. That maximum violence does not always equate to maximum effectiveness. That there is wisdom in restraint, power in recognizing human limitations and working with them instead of against them. These truths, discovered by Harrison under extreme circumstances, apply to countless situations far beyond the military context. In workplaces, schools, families, communities, anywhere where some people have authority or influence over others, these lessons are relevant. Treat people, not as resources or tools. Recognize that everyone has limits, and that pushing people beyond those limits produces not superior results but broken human beings. Have the courage to question when established practices seem to be causing unnecessary harm. Put real well-being above abstract metrics or approval from distant authorities. These are not complicated lessons. In many respects, they are obvious. But obvious doesn't mean easy to implement, especially when it goes against established culture or the expectations of those in power. It requires courage, as Harrison demonstrated. It requires a willingness to risk disapproval, criticism, even punishment. But it also offers profound rewards. The satisfaction of knowing that you made a real difference, that you alleviated suffering, that you preserved human dignity in circumstances that could easily have destroyed it. That you were, in your own small corner of the world, a force for good, for compassion, for practical wisdom. Harrison lived through it. And although his story is little known, although he never received widespread recognition for his innovation, the impact was real, profound, and lasting for those who mattered most. The men under his direct command. And perhaps there's a final lesson in this as well. That public recognition, fame, a place in history books, none of that really matters. What matters is the real difference you make in real lives. And that difference often happens quietly, without fanfare, known only to those directly affected. But it is no less significant for that. In fact, it may be even more significant precisely because it is personal, direct, human on a scale that we can truly comprehend. Not abstract millions saved, but hundreds of specific individuals you knew by name, whose faces you saw daily, whose well-being you directly influenced. Harrison had that kind of impact, and he left behind not stone monuments or chapters in history books, but lives lived a little better, minds preserved a little more intact, humanity held a little more firmly in the face of circumstances that seemed designed to destroy it. May we all have Harrison's wisdom to question orthodoxy when it seems to cause unnecessary harm. May we have his compassion to prioritize genuine well-being over conformity or appearances. May we have his courage to stand up for what we believe is right, even when it is difficult or unpopular. And may we remember, in our own lives and decisions, that even in the darkest places, even in the most difficult circumstances, individual choices matter, compassion makes a difference, and humanity can be preserved if we have the wisdom and courage to protect it. The trenches are silent now, but the lessons echo through decades. And as long as there are people willing to learn from Harrison, to apply his wisdom in their own contexts, to choose compassion over conformity and human well-being over rigid doctrine, his legacy lives on, making a difference one life at a time, one act of compassionate wisdom at a time. May the Lord God bless all those who, like Harrison, choose compassion, wisdom, and the preservation of human dignity even in the most difficult circumstances. May we all find the courage to make a difference in our own spheres of influence, always remembering that every life matters, every mind deserves protection, and every moment of compassion ripple out in ways we can never fully know but which are nonetheless profoundly real and profoundly meaningful.